Hello, everyone, and it's a great honor for us today to have Colin Feltham, who, for me at least, is the most important theoreticians of depressive realism. And we are discussing today his book, Depressive Realism, Interdisciplinary Perspective. And maybe we'll also have a chance to discuss Sappho's On a Tragic, the new translation, which I know that Colin was asked to comment on, and we are reading this book too. So I will start with questions. I have a couple of questions, and then if anyone have questions, then you're welcome to ask. Maybe we should actually trying to define depressive realism. We should have actually started with it. Or maybe in the new version of depressive realism that you would still agree with, maybe more moderate in a way. How would you define it right now?
Okay. All right. Well, I think I agree with stuff that you've written, Julie, about the default position, which is that life is good, life is positive, majority of people are positive, and it's healthy to be positive. And depressive realism, to the contrary, would say that no, life at least holds many negatives. And that's the truth of the matter, that life does hold many negatives, particularly the inescapable ones of, as in Buddhism, that we suffer, we get older, we get ill, and we die. And the prospect of death touches us all unless we're able to defend against it in one way or another. In everyday terms, for me, depressive realism means that those things are around us and yet they are still denied. So let me give you an example. I belong to a social group of people of around my age. Quite a few of them are bereaved. You know, their long-term partners have died and they are widowed, or they're widowed, that kind of thing. And yet the purpose of this group is to overcome loneliness. And then I understand that as well. Let's be honest with each other. But the honesty bit is one of the things that's sometimes missing. I think because people find it too painful to be honest about death and loneliness. And that those for me are inescapable features of life. We do die, people around us die. And yet it's painful for most people to admit that and to talk about it. If I bring it up, I'm very aware that I'm seen as the odd one out. I mean, I've been used to that kind of all my life, really. You know, people have joked about me since I was a teenager, I guess. You know, the character Eeyore, is it a donkey? The sad, miserable sort of creature. That was kind of something I was cast as, I suppose, young. But it happens now as well. So I'm aware more from other people towards me that there's this thing, a view of life, which most people see as unwanted, unhealthy, and yet, you know, they can't actually say, well, it's not true. They know that we're all coming towards the end of life. And I'm quite happy to talk about, I'm probably more happy to talk about. In fact, one of my defenses probably is humor. Perhaps like yours, Julie. I don't know, you laugh and giggle quite a bit, I think. But what I notice is that people around me, particularly at one of these social groups, talk a lot about things like holidays. So a typical conversation will begin with, have you been anywhere nice lately? Or are you going anywhere nice? And that's fair enough. It's harmless enough. And then I'll joke about, you know, I'll say, well, no, let's talk about death and dying, you know. And people laugh as if I'm a misery, which in some ways I am, I suppose. But then I don't travel much. I don't go on holidays much, you know. My life is more internal. And I have more fun inside my head than lying on a beach, I suppose. So anyway, that's not defining depressive realism. To try and attempt to define it would be something like, life contains many negatives, yes, and ultimately is negative. Ultimately, we are annihilated. And when people describe death, for instance, as, he passed or he passed over, there's something about that I find difficult to leave alone. Perhaps I get a bit too literal-minded, a bit too contrarian, and I want to say, no, where did this person pass to? What's supposed to have happened? But then even ordinary linguistic usage, like when we say, my mother died 50 odd years ago, that's literally true. But the phrase "she died" almost means nothing, or "she's been dead for 50 years" means nothing. It's incorrect language, isn't it? She's not been in any state of death for 50 years. She ceased being, she ceased her existence 50 years ago. Let's put it that way. So I'm often preoccupied with, silly language games in my head, I suppose. But I think it's generally something we don't really want to get at. In academia, I haven't been employed in the university now for 14 years. But I'm aware that, I don't know if there are departments of death studies, for example, but it's not really a popular subject compared with, let's say, women's studies, queer studies, counselling studies, all sorts of other subjects. I think there's a bit of a growth. I've been to a couple of death cafes in London this year, and so there's a bit of a sense of interest in it. But then, when I mention that to other people, they just think I'm a freak for going to a death cafe. Who would want to do that? So there's a mismatch between, I think, a majority view of life. Life is good. Life can be made good. You should do cheerful things like going on holiday. And not to do that there's something weird about not taking lots of holidays. But it's not in my nature really to do that. And so I'm assuming that that's true for some of the people taking part this evening. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there are more people like you now. There's getting more of us. The world is helping us with horror. But the other question is, maybe you were critical before, and you're probably still critical, maybe in a different way, of the therapy, psychotherapy, and therapeutic society, and precisely psychoanalysis. And you're one of the rare people who used to, at least, would agree that psychoanalysis more resembles religion than against religion, because normally it's seen as something that is against, opposite to religion. And I would agree with you that it resembles religion. It's a shelter from life negativity. Do you still think so?
Okay. On the whole, I think yes. On the whole, I do think so. I'm often reminded of who was it? Some Nobel Prize winner who described psychoanalysis as the greatest hoax of the 20th century. Now, I don't think that's entirely true. Occasionally, I do see some value in some aspects of psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic theories in some aspects of it. But in practice, I'm far from convinced. I've seen some bad examples. I've known some people who've had terrible experiences in psychoanalysis. And on the other hand, I know people who say they've been in analysis, they're paying a high sum for. I've heard of somebody recently who's apparently paying £200 an hour for psychoanalysis, which I just think is ridiculous. If anybody is that good to be charging that much, we should all go and get analysis from them. So I think it has a ridiculous overclaim quality about it, but it has some insights as well. Obviously, it's much newer than all the major religions. I don't think I'd categorize it as a religion as such, but it is a kind of an ideology to which many people are attracted. I mean, it doesn't have a god. Freud, I think, was pretty much a atheistic Jew. Yeah, I don't know. Is that the beginning of an answer anyway?
Yeah, it is the beginning. What is your involvement with the therapy?
Okay. Well, I was made redundant at the age of 60. So for about 40, well, for 14 years now, I've not been employed and I've not seen clients. So before that, I saw clients, I supervised other counselors, I trained a lot of counselors, both in England and in Denmark, which I was living in some of that time. And I suppose, yeah, I was sort of a believer that counseling, I tend to use the term counseling rather than therapy because that was my background. I tended to believe that it could be helpful, helping people along the way. When I first got involved in therapy, it was in the 1970s when I was in my late 20s. And I went to Los Angeles to have primal therapy with Arthur Janov and those people. And that was the closest I ever got to joining up to some group and being a believer, if you like. Otherwise, I've always been very skeptical of any group. And so in the beginning, I believe that if we talked openly about our lives and cried and were completely open, we would shed all the psychological pain and we would turn into fantastic new human specimens, something like that. I don't know if you know the primal literature, but one of Janov's books was called Primal Man, and he did sort of convey the idea that we would become like new people. We would even live longer, all sorts of ideas which I sort of believed at the time, and I now think are just crazy. So that sort of form of humanistic therapy was what I came into that field believing, and progressively disbelieved. But I still believe that, you know, it was helpful to offer people attentive listening, I suppose. I still believe that's true. I still believe that people can get a lot from being taken seriously, I suppose. I'll put it that way. It's being listened to, being taken seriously, being shown some compassion. And sometimes just in everyday life situations, that happens. It just happens that, you know, I'll be in a supermarket and I notice that the cashier looks miserable and I'll say, "What's up? You look down," or something, you know, and it's in everyday human interactions. And if you just treat people humanly, they respond, you know, they can see that someone's treating them as human beings. So for me, that's the sort of mini therapy interaction, if you like, but not formal therapy.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Colin. Can I just ask one more question? Sorry, everyone. So it's not the question, it's like rather invitation to think together. And you already know, Colin, that I'm trying to, I'm looking for more feminist version of depressive realism, and it's problematic for me because I tend to see, I would agree, I would count myself as depressive realist, but there is something still in it that I cannot fully accept. And I think this is because it's still male-centered perspective, especially in a philosophy. It's all started with, let's say, with Schopenhauer and the fact that he was misogynist. I think it both comes, for me, I associate it still with this kind of, it's not that it's not feminist, it's not feminine perspective. I'm trying to look for more feminine view of depressive realism. And I tend to think that that it might be against Sapfer if we finally want to start to discuss Sapfer. And Schopenhauer, they both associated, and it's conventionally associated, the human suffering, the worst negativity that we have was overly developed consciousness or something like that, which is traditionally seen as male features. And women from this perspective, and for the reason that they are mothers, like not maybe women, but mothers, would be seen as more positive, or at least forced to be nurturing and to protect from the world negativity. But I think that it is more like there is more suffering in the subject of the mother than the subject, not the subject of a woman, but subject of the mother, because it's different subject from male subject. It's death-centered subject. It's someone who and someone who is not suffering individually. That's another point. The conventional perspective is that it's the figure of a male whose suffering is individualized, and the worst horror is horror of personal death for Heidegger and for forever. That's what we know and why we suffer. And from this more feminist perspective, it would be more the horror of relationship with other. It's like, and Zappa writes about it beautifully, that if you bring a child into the world, if you bring life into the world, you also bring death by.
Yes.
And I don't think that mothers, because they maybe appear as more cheerful and they have to nurture and protect from negativity. I actually think that this is more tragic position because you know it. And that's one of the reasons I change my mind about self-help and all the positivity, because there is, in some sense, there is more despair, especially now in this position, more tragedy in this position than in the individual suffering or even egoistic suffering, which is more like theatrical. That's the suffering of depressive realism. And I'm thinking maybe this quiet suffering that is already there in the world, even if it's denied, but maybe this kind of denial is the only form of acceptance. So that would be my strange interpretation of depressive realism that I'm still working on. But the question was actually if or extended consciousness and the absence of meaning is not the main defining suffering of a human being, what else could it be, you think?
Okay, I'm trying to grasp exactly what you're saying. I'm not sure if I have it, but if we're talking about feminism, partly, I imagine that one of the reasons some women are not as enmeshed in depressive realism is that they have a fight on their hands. You know, if you are a feminist, you see patriarchy as something. Patriarchy is the enemy, and patriarchy is something to be overcome, and that brings with it a lot of energy. You know, we must overcome patriarchy, and I guess behind the sort of form of maybe male depressive realism you're talking about is the sense that there is nothing beyond that. That things are. Yeah, there isn't anything to be overcome. There is something essentially, I suppose this goes back to Zappa and that sort of form of thinking. There is something essentially hopeless about the human condition because we are over-evolved. And that has nothing to do with particular circumstances about being a man or a woman or living in a certain era or place. It's about the human psyche itself. Now, you're saying, are you, that even then women are in a different position from men? Is that right? Women.
I have my own version of feminism, and it's depressive feminism, because
Okay.
feminism for me is a depressive position because, well, now I think that as we are overcoming patriarchy, we get disillusioned that patriarchy is the source of all evil. Now it's even worse, but I think that we still have to do it because it's the right thing to do to fight against it. But for me, patriarchy was the promise. Not only for me, for Simone de Beauvoir would write about the figure of man in a patriarchy as a figure of savior, so equivalent for a woman to a figure of God. You know, there is someone who will save us, someone who we can rely on, and losing this idea of salvation. This is depressive. So feminist for me is quite a depressive position. It's even worse than losing God because it's someone embodied. You know, God is abstract. You can invent it in your head and rely on the father figure. But the man, the absence of a man, that man is illusion. It would never save you. And you have to nonetheless, so it's not, yes, there is this part of feminism that you see patriarchy as the cause of all evil, which inspires you, you know, to fight with it and gives you hope that the world will be amazing when it's gone. But there is also depressive part of it, which I think is more substantial, is living without in after patriarchal world, without patriarchy, and seeing that it's only even worse, but nonetheless we are more mature now or something like that. So for me it's quite a depressive thing nonetheless that we have to go through for, I don't know, for some reason.
Okay. Let me try and answer that by coming at it sort of sideways with a different example, and that's that David Benatar, I think, had a dialogue with Jordan Peterson at some point that I listened to. And I don't think Benatar was happy with Peterson's view of what he had written. Perhaps he hadn't read it properly. But the thing that I remember Peterson saying was that the answer to well, it wasn't, it couched in the terms of depressive realism, but the answer was for men to show character, that the way to stand up against the big negatives and death and so on is to show character. And that, you know, something that traditionally was always the case, that men were the providers, the warriors, and that there was a natural order. You tell me how you react to this. There was a natural order where men were, like animals, the warriors and the breadwinners and would be, I suppose, saviors of women. And that was part of the natural order, and women would feel safe in that natural order. And now feminism has torn that apart, and nobody feels safe. So men don't feel loved, women don't feel safe. And actually, to some extent, I would go along with that idea that although feminism certainly had a justified cause in the beginning, it's now torn people apart in the same way that anti-racism has torn apart blacks and whites, and LGBT activism has torn apart straight people and gay people. So I think something terrible has happened in the last, I don't know, 30, 50 years. And that's not directly answering your question, but does it feed into what you mean?
Yeah, I would think about it as a natural order, patriarchal natural order, in the same way as it was more natural to believe in God. It doesn't mean
Yeah.
that God used to exist. It was just maybe easier to maintain the illusion of
Yeah.
God existing. And now, once we know that it's just an illusion, it's
Yeah.
hard to participate in it. And before, maybe we had to believe you both. It was problematic to be atheist and problematic to be feminist. Now it's not problematic, and I cannot force to deny that it's just an illusion that we have to play along to feel better. So now we forced rather not to have illusion, and we don't really know what to do without the illusion.
So let's see. Does that mean that the illusion that a man is going to save you has now also died, as well as the illusion of God existing? Is that
Well, it died for me at least. So.
it died for you? Yes. Well, and
Because
also well for many women, yeah. And is still being encouraged. You know, feminism encourages the idea that men, there's nothing special about men or anyone, that women have to create their own salvation, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. How does this feed into the topic? So that does that give you a sort of double dose of depressive realism, if you like?
I think
There isn't a God.
it makes
Sorry,
me depressive, really. I think in this absence of God or illusion of salvation that it's possible, it makes me depressive realist. And even more because as a mother, I came to recognize this idea of mother. Mother is also the one who's supposed to be a savior. Who's supposed to protect and nurture you and give you unconditional love. I think it's another fantasy that, well, because I have troubles of giving this illusion to my child, unconditional love. I think it's another illusion that we are losing, that there is, mother is also just a human being, and love is also quite problematic, but what maybe gives me hope is that in this world where we lost all of the illusions of the mother that doesn't exist as a caring, unconditionally caring feature, that mothers are problematic human beings, tired and the rest of the things. The savior man, man who is a savior doesn't exist. God doesn't exist. What sustains my motherhood, for example, is that I feel sorry that I'm not able to provide, to sustain this illusion enough. you know, maybe this is how still relationship between people might work. We feel sorry for each other, that we're sharing the feeling of loss, of inability. If we feel sorry for each other, that this illusion doesn't work anymore, something like it. So at least mourning together the loss of illusion, something like it.
Yeah, that does make a kind of sense. For some reason, what went through my mind then is the film, at least, of the Cormac McCarthy novel, The Road. Did you see that?
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, things are so awful that the mother can't take it. She just can't take it. I think she wanders off to kill herself, while the father takes the son on the road, and he is in the traditional role of the protector of the son. That's just one version, perhaps, of the mother just can't stomach the horror anymore. I'm trying to get into that and understand you better. I mean, I had two sons, and one of them jokingly says to me, he says, "I thought you were over all that depressive realism stuff." You know, I told him about this evening, and I said, "Well, yes and no. You know, it's nothing that will ever really go away, but obviously I have to um, interact with him and give." Yeah, I feel torn between giving him hope for having a normal life. He got married last year. He's thinking about having kids, buying a house, all that sort of stuff. And on the other hand, he knows that I think that life is, I really don't know how to put it anymore, that life contains lots of negatives, and I can't lie about that. I remember, if it's all right, wandering around a bit here, because I'm a father. When one of my kids was very little, he one day said, "Are you going to die one day, Daddy?" You know, so maybe you've had that conversation, I don't know. And I thought about it and said, "Well, yes, one day, but not for a long time," you know, to reassure him. And then he said, "Am I going to die one day, Daddy?" You know. And then I thought, well, I'm supposed to give some sort of, you know, reassuring answer to that, and I don't know what to say. So it's being torn between truth and well, comfort, I guess we could understand that term. And I said, well, yes, you are, but not for a very, very long time, you know. And that's the closest I could come to balancing truth with, I don't know what the other thing is called. Comfort, I suppose. Yeah.
I think this is what you do in your book, right? But for a larger audience, more elaborated way.
What
All right.
to try and do both.
Yeah. If anyone, sorry for taking so long. If anyone else have questions, you can ask them.
Well, if I can just say about that, trying to be balanced about this, I do, yeah, I mean, part of me is a contrarian. So if everybody starts telling me that life is shit, I'll start to think, no, it isn't, no, it isn't, you know, whatever you say, I'll try and see the opposite point of view. But what was I going to say then? This is where getting old is not very nice. You forget your thread, you know, and you forget what you were about to say. I've forgotten. Never mind, it'll come back. Go on.
Sorry. Anyone have questions? No? You're just here to listen.
That's okay. Actually, in the question of balance, I do think there's a balance. I think another input here for me is, and it goes back to religion. I don't believe in religion, but from very early on in my life, I did have some experiences which interested me, and that included taking some LSD when I was about 18. And I've always had a belief that a lot goes back to I think you've written about neurology, haven't you, Julie?
Mm-hmm.
So there is a question of whether we call it neurotheology or what we want to call it. I don't know. That the way the brain is wired, I'm sure this also goes back to Zapffer. We've evolved beyond what's useful for us or truthful for us, but there is still something within the brain that holds perhaps a key to some better way of living. Let's put it that way. And so people like Eckhart Tolle, for instance, the idea of the now, the power of the now, and all that sort of literature, perhaps people know that, is real for me. And I've been in lots of therapy type groups, encounter groups, that kind of thing, where sometimes there's a rule that we are talking to each other in the now. We're not going to talk about everything else. We're just going to talk about each other, how we experience each other, what's going through our minds. And so I'd say right now, as we are talking to each other and people are listening, depressive realism, in a sense, is a sort of theoretical construct. It's not real in the now. You know, my brain is not sort of besieged with obsessive thoughts about my death or how terrible life is or war or anything else. It's concentrating on what we're saying to each other. And they're referring back to what you said earlier about the self being relational, in a sense. So we are all relating to each other. And just for a short time, depressive realism perhaps isn't operating. It's there, and we come back to it afterwards, we think about it, but it's not the only thing happening in the brain. So I guess, I mean, I'm not qualified to really talk about neuroscience, but I think within all of our brains, there is some sort of deep-seated conflict going on. And perhaps in the same way that if there are such things as depressive realists, has been a minority of people who've seen life that way, but it's also been a minority of people who've been enlightened. And I'm not trying to equate those two things. I'm certainly not enlightened, but I think the brain is structured in such a way that there's a sort of neurodiversity, which means that some people are highly gifted artistically, spiritually, and some people have deep insights into the despair of the human condition, if you like. So there is in theory, there's a balance, that even within people who are very depressed, there's the potential for something else. Can I put it that way?
Yeah, it's a great point. It reminds me of Beyond talking, well, anyway, that unconscious is in between people. And during the session, during the discussion or something, this is what is happening. The unconscious is someday through the interaction, something appears, the concept. So the depressive realism is not, I like it that it's not individualistic, it's interrelational concept. It's concept of, well, on one hand is something that unites, on the other hand, something that we can define together, or something that exists in communication to define someone to someone. And thinking about people who are depressed, who we can describe as depressive realist, it can be seen, it's a good idea to see them as part of neurodiversity. It's my what I'm trying to do with depression, just seeing depressed people as a certain type of being, not as a deviated from the norm, but in itself, like see it not as a deviation, but as the whatever, just human. And it's true actually that we not only we are cursed as humans with depression from time to time, with sadness and suffering, but also it's inevitable, but also happiness is inevitable, sometimes in a weirdest situation where it's not inappropriate, but we all feel it. But at the same point, what we choose to define the instance ourselves through, we normally tend to define ourselves, associate ourselves with happiness and see happiness as natural. But for me, I'm wondering, and what I do, I'm trying to define, give space for people to define themselves through depression, to associate themselves with depression, even though they might be happy from time to time. But maybe I'm overdoing it, because people tend to present themselves as more depressed than they really are when they're talking to me. But nonetheless, this kind of exploration of depression, maybe space for some to be more honest, is what interests me. And it's very important that you added intersubjective dimension to it, that it's something in between individuals, how we define each other. It's a group kind of work.
Yeah, I mean, when we meet each other, when people meet, I think there's an awareness. We are fellow human beings. We often feel awkward with each other. We feel friendly towards each other or antagonistic at times. And I'm aware of that all the time. I mean, I can quickly jump to conclusions. I meet a new person. I think, no, I don't like them for some reason. I don't like their face, all sorts of idiosyncratic reactions. But I can also feel very warm towards people. And I think that goes for everybody. I don't know if this is relevant, an experience I had just after my mother died. And that, as I say, it was a long time ago, 50 odd years. And I was coming down from Scotland for the funeral because I was away at university. And I remember sitting on a London Underground train. I was in a slightly shocked state of, I think I was shocked. And I remember looking around at people from an awareness of other people's minds, and an awareness of. Are you still hearing me, Julie? Can you still
Yeah.
hear me? Yeah. Okay. An
Yes.
awareness that people may be suffering all sorts of things or be in all sorts of states of mind that I couldn't possibly be aware of. I think I was feeling very compassionate, if you like, or in a different state of mind from my usual state of mind because I was sort of in shock, I suppose. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's also depression is also might be, or just sadness might be not only within, but this way of connecting and seeing the world, this state of being in the world and being with others. Levon has question for quite a
Okay.
while.
Okay.
I'd just like to explore how depressive realism fits with bravery. Lisa Feldman Barrett has a great little book called 7.5 Facts About the Brain. And she
Yeah.
talks about how, upwards of 85% of what we do in a given day is unconscious. We just sort of unconsciously go through life. We're kind of tyrannized by our brain.
Yeah.
And, when I think of depressive realism, because my son, I would classify him very much like this. He's in his 20s. He sees things that, he's brave enough to see them, but it does cause him a lot of pain, like he's very mindful, almost too mindful, and in the moment and seeing things. And it takes a lot of bravery to go through life that way. So I'm just curious to know your thoughts on how you feel about that.
On bravery. Well, he presumably he I don't know whether you're calling him your son a depressive realist, but it sounds like he does see life in that sort of way, and he doesn't choose to be that way. He just is that way. Perhaps it fits with what Julie just said about neurodivergence, that some of us just have that way of reacting to the world. Then, if you're saying, well, he has to be brave to live by that, I guess there's some truth in that, although. In a sense, it's choiceless, I think, if you are structured in that way. Of course, I guess we all go through the experience of being, I don't know, slightly false in our responses. So a typical one is when people say, "How are you?" We all tend to say, "I'm fine," because we're taught that that's what we should say. And I don't know what your son is like, but I always had trouble with that simple interaction. How are you? And that I wouldn't call that bravery to say, well, I'm feeling lonely, I'm feeling sad or whatever. Maybe it's bravery. I don't know what's the best word, but it's more like not feeling there's much choice other than to be honest. Is this going a little way towards answering what you asked?
Yeah, no, I'm just, yeah, I mean, from my perspective, because I'm not so much a depressive realist. I'd say I was someone who was more unconsciously going through life, very naive. Married young, had 3 kids, never really thought about how I was unconsciously being driven in my life psychologically. It wasn't till I hit my 40s and got sick and realized, oh, why did I marry the way I did? And, uncovered all this stuff about my childhood and how I was unconsciously functioning. My son seems very different. He seems to understand things young that I never even thought about. So how you're talking about it, I feel like I'm putting a filter of my own understanding on it. I see it as brave. What you seem to be saying is that it's not really bravery. It's just you're catapulted into it without a choice. And
Yes.
and then you're having to deal with it, and you don't see it as bravery. So now I'm curious to ask my son if he would see it as bravery. He might answer differently and answer like you. I'm not sure, but I love what you said. Yeah.
Yeah, you could ask him about that. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call my response a brave one. Well, sometimes it might, in some situations, perhaps it calls for some bravery. I've rarely, but occasionally, I've been in a situation, in a group situation, where someone's asked me, and I realize I'm expected to give a certain sort of answer, and then there's a choice occasionally. So. Yeah, say in the world of therapy, I've been in that position where people expect me to be very positive. The idea that psychotherapy makes people happy, if you like, or takes away their depression. And I have to flounder a bit and find a good way of giving an answer that I think is true to what I believe is true. And on the other hand, gives people a bit of what they're after. So, I don't think therapy is useless, as some people do, but I do think sometimes it fails. I think usually it doesn't live up to its hype, and on the other hand, it can be helpful. It's trying to get a middle way, I suppose, of answering people. But you're saying for you it's different because you only came to some of these perceptions later in life. Is that right?
Yeah, I think when you go through your life unconsciously, I mean, maybe part of the reason we do that is because life is such an existential threat that, we're kind of designed to just run unconsciously because it's easier to rely on your heuristics. You don't have to think about what you're doing.
Yeah.
I just got married young, and my older brother, he knew too much. Now, for him to get married, he's going to have to be incredibly brave.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I'm kind of seeing how my unconscious way that I went through life helped me to a certain degree. So I see you as very brave when you see these real things and existential threats about life and how horrible things can be. I see that as very brave to continue to face the world.
Okay, you're calling yourself unconscious to some extent, but maybe I'm being contrarian here. But sometimes I wish I had been a bit more normal and unconscious when I was younger. Um, there used to be an idea, I think, in say Southeast Asia, that for Buddhists, the pattern of life should be that you should have a normal life, you should get married and have kids and a successful job, and then you turn to spirituality when you're old. And for me, it hasn't been that way at all. It was being, over concerned with all the big questions when I was young, when I should have been having more fun, And I don't think there is any correct way of doing life. So, it's been a certain way for you and a different way for your son and your brother.
Very much so. Thank you for answering my question.
Thanks for your question. Yeah.
Thank you, Levon. Sam has a question.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm trying to form this into a question. I was thinking about Colin, when you spoke about being on the train and feeling more connected, and I was thinking about maybe the difference between grief and depression.
Yeah.
And maybe this links into Julie's wondering about a more feminine version of depressive realism that I remember in the beginning of your book, you talked about Ian McGilchrist's idea of, he talks about the left brain and the right brain, doesn't he? And the idea that when it's the left brain, you're kind of dissecting things, putting things into theories and patterns. And that's kind of what I associate with a depressive mindset. And you look at the world as mechanistic and its categories and its logic. But then when we're in grief, there is this expansion and this connection that is maybe that the right brain.
Yes.
It's still painful, it's still grief, but it is still sadness, but it doesn't feel the same way.
Yes.
And there's something about that for me that we can connect in a different way to the sadness and the tragedy in that way of being or thinking.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to respond, except I'm aware of the hemispherical sort of argument of McGilchrist, and unfortunately, sometimes I think that turns into the idea an either-or question. You know, either we are very masculine and compartmentalized, or we're very emotional and more female, or whatever. And what would be optimal is to have a sort of free flow between those two hemispheres. Yeah, sorry, we're still okay, are we? I've got a different picture up on my screen, so I don't know if we've lost connection. Yes, I think there is something in that. I mean, without wanting to stereotype women as more emotional, I think broadly speaking, there is something in that. Oddly enough, as I said, I'm 74 now, and only really quite recently, one or two people have said to me, or I've been thinking, maybe I'm a bit autistic, you know, which goes along with being a man. I'm a bit autistic. And maybe there's some truth in that, you know, coming back to the question of bravery, it can sound like bravery to say things in a stark fashion to people, which surprises them sometimes. But maybe not. Maybe it's just the way we're wired to speak in that way. But there is also access to the other side of the brain, and I'm conscious of that. So sometimes if I'm listening to music, or sometimes even in humor, you know, in finding something extremely funny, laughing a lot, laughing till you cry, I think that's when there's a sort of flip between one side of the brain to the other, presumably, if that's what's happening. But whether women, on the whole, perhaps are more in touch with the right hemisphere and feel the depressive aspects of life more keenly or more emotionally. Yeah, it wasn't a question, I know you said, so I'm just thinking out loud.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for thinking against my thinking.
Okay.
I think it's a great comment, even outside of the thinking of a left and right hemisphere, just seeing depression or grief as intersubjective on one hand, or feeling connecting to the world instead of or just connecting to the world and seeing world differently and feeling the pain of the world in a way, or this instead of different treatment of depression as it is treated now, categorized as something individual with a certain deviation. So I think it's important to as an alternative to common comprehension of depression, this idea of grief as the way of connection or something intersubjective way of connection to the world is quite impressive. Or the very idea of categorizing the world, of being rational, it might be seen as a denial, not just the hemisphere of the type of thinking, but in general as a form of denial of whatever grief of the world. And the feeling of grief might be just the state where this denial doesn't work anymore for you. It collapses in a way. And maybe there are different people who are more prone to this, who are more into the denial and who are less. For example, Levon, if we want to come back to, I think that having 3 kids, maybe it's coming back to the idea that we need to be in a safe space, safe enough to be depressive realism, to reflect. I think it just was in the wrong space, you know, too much suffering to reflect on, because 3 kids is hard. And after when it was become more safe to reflect, you started to feel it, the horror of the position of a woman with 3 kids in a world. So it's not that you was unconscious, not suffering, but you actually was so much suffering that you couldn't even, not safe enough to reflect on it, to doubt it at this time. Sorry for using you as an example.
Yeah, no, I think you're really right that part of the reason I was so not aware was how afraid I was. I was very traumatized as a child, so just being unaware of what was really going on was a strategy to survive, but it just compounded and compounded until I became older, and it took incredible bravery to actually become aware of that reality for me, right?
You can compete with your son, who is more of a depressive realism.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing to correlate. I don't know, there's a lot more thought there for me to do, so
yeah. I don't know how to put this, but talking like this in this way, I don't know any of you, and we're talking sort of in a disembodied way, aren't we? Across space, not really knowing each other. We can't. We only have a limited amount of time. I'm thinking back to groups I've been in, including quite long-term groups that have lasted sort of all day or all week, that kind of thing. And there's a lot of time to go into things in depth, and we are physically together. And sometimes instead of speaking, there'd be a lot of looking at each other or reaching out or holding someone's hand or whatever. And I think all of those expressions are, if you like, right hemisphere, I suppose, expressions of I think I can see or feel where you're coming from, but I don't have the words to relate back to you what I think I'm experiencing. All of that sort of thing. We can't get at here, perhaps. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I mean, when you invited me to do this, Julie, I thought, well, I've got to be impressive and intellectual, and I've got to come up with really clever stuff. And so that's another strand, isn't it? And I've got to somehow present as a depressive realist or not, or say something clever and new and interesting. That's also part of the human condition. And
Sorry for that.
no,
Right.
sorry.
Matt has a question.
Sure.
No, I just wanted to say to you, Colin, I think all that work you've done with groups and stuff, it shows up in here. I mean, many of us here don't really know each other, but for some reason, these meetings always create a space that I associate with a heart space. I like the word courage, maybe more than bravery, because it refers to the heart. And to me, the heart is a place that love and grief reside together. And that's a hamstring cramp, dehydration. and I just also think maybe that for me, life has been pretty good with some initial hard realities, but I think life is like something that I think I chose to partake in. We must say we're just born and thrown in here, but I don't feel that. I feel like I chose it, and that it gives opportunities for moments like this to receive something and to manifest something. And it's like, okay, I signed up to play rugby, so you gotta get smashed and the teeth knocked out, but signed up. Okay. So here we are.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you for showing up the way you did today.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm sorry we don't have more time to get into some of these things. Yeah.
Thank you, Matt. If anyone have more questions, you can ask. Otherwise, I think we can leave and be depressive realism on our own, or not be. Okay. No. Okay, then thank you everyone for joining, especially Colin, and for answering all the questions. I really like our meetings, and I see some of you in the future. Maybe Colin too. All right.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.